Muchas gracias, and thank you very much for having me here. I apologize, I have to speak in English. Your English is much better than my Spanish will ever be, so much safer in that instance to see how this goes. This is another project. These students launched a 3D printer up to the International Space Station. A large amount of the weight that we carry up to the space station is extra parts. If you have a valve that goes bad, you better have a replacement part. And so we have multiple redundancy spare parts. They launched this up to the space station back in November. About 2 weeks ago, we created and fabricated the first ever objects not made on the surface of the Earth. If you have a smartphone, this has more computing power in it than the entire US government had at its disposal in the 1980s, okay? Which is why it runs a little bit hot. There's quite a lot of computing power in this device. And it's inconceivable, but that keeps going. This is today this size. In 25 years, this will be the size of a blood cell. And what would we do with that level of computation? Now we're seeing things like quantum computing come along. We're actually reaching the end of integrated circuits. The chips are getting very hot down at the surface level, but now we're seeing 3D chip design, integrated circuits, and quantum computing. Like anything quantum, it seems to work. Nobody knows quite how, and it requires quite a lot of tequila to discuss, so I won't get into it here. But as we miniaturize all of this, we're creating devices all over the world. 10 years ago, we had 500 million devices connected to the internet. Today, we have about 11 billion connected devices. By the end of the decade, we will have 20 or 50 billion connected devices, and shortly after that, we're going to 1 trillion. Right? So just that one metric, we're going from 11 billion connected devices today to 1 trillion connected devices in a decade and a half. Here's an example. This company can take a 10-second clip of your voice, and by analyzing the tonal variations, can give you an 85% accurate assessment of what is your mood and what is your underlying attitude. Right? Try this out on your spouse. If you want to have an interesting discussion, please tell them first that you're doing this. But there's an app called Moody's that you can download to try this out. Now imagine that, right? Imagine that in 5 years we have cameras that look at your muscle twitches and so on. I predict right now that in about 5 years, it will be impossible to lie. So your marketing departments have to be a bit careful. What will our politicians do? Interesting discussions and questions will come along as we do this. Now, as we digitize, we become very disruptive. And the best analogy we have found to frame this is photography. Some of you in the room are old enough to remember film photography, and you're operating from a scarcity model. You can only carry so much film around. It costs $1 a photograph or so to get your prints. It takes about a week to get them back, so you don't know what photograph you actually took for a few days. And we conserve every shot and we optimize every shot very carefully, right? When you change the substrate and we move to digital photography, 2 or 3 very important things happen. The first is that the marginal cost goes to 0. Now we can take 1,000 more photographs, the cost is the same. The second, as a result, the domain explodes. About 20 years ago, we had about 1 billion film photographs processed in the US that year. Today, per day, we are uploading 1 billion digital photographs up to Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, because the cost goes to 0 and so on. The most important thing that happens, though, is that we shift the problem space. We shift the problem space from a scarcity problem space, where we take courses in photography so we can optimize every shot, and we shift it to an abundance problem space. What I mean by that is that we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 different devices, and we simply can't find the good stuff, right? Because it's buried. And so we've shifted the problem space, and we're now drowning in an abundance of photographs. And essentially this explosion, this inflection point driven by this information environment, this same explosion we're now seeing across all of these domains. They're all going through this explosion. And of course, once you have something in a digital environment, you can apply machine learning, correlation, modeling, simulations, and that drives the pace of change even faster. Let me run through some of the technologies that we are seeing. One of them is 3D printing. Many of you are familiar with 3D printing. We're essentially information-enabled manufacturing. And there are 2 aspects of 3D printing that have and cause this extraordinary acceleration. The first is, if you look at the ball on the top right, you cannot mold that. That has to be assembled. Yet a 3D printer can print that out. And so for the first time in manufacturing, we can replicate objects without needing a mold. The second, and more interesting, is that it's always been true in manufacturing that a more complex object costs more. The design, the fabrication, the materials, and so on. For the first time ever, with 3D printing, complexity is free. The printer doesn't care if I'm printing the little yellow thing in the middle or one of the more complex objects around the side. It's just spitting out the material. Another technology we're looking at is artificial intelligence and robotics. We use AI to run the world today, right? Whether it's anti-lock braking systems, credit card fraud detection, and so on. Essentially, if we removed artificial intelligence from the world, everything would stop. And the reason that we use AI is we have not had an upgrade in our brains in about 50,000 years. We're very hardwired to old biases. I am programmed, for example, to store every calorie of energy in my body because biologically my body does not know where my next meal is coming from. Today we kind of know, we actually need to program away from that. You've all seen these $20 helicopters that all the kids are playing with today. 5 years ago, that $20 helicopter cost $700, okay? 8 years ago, it wasn't even possible. That level of miniaturization, servo motor, stabilizer. So something that wasn't possible 8 years ago, 5 years ago, $700, and now it's down to $20, and we throw it away in a toy helicopter. One more technology I'll cover is biotech and bioinformatics. 50 years ago, we discovered the human genome, and we found that life is actually information-based. You take A, T, C, and G, the 4 core molecules of DNA, assemble those in interesting ways, and you get all of the diversity that we have in life. When you learn a new language, you learn how to read, then we learn how to do comprehension, then we learn how to write, right? We've learned now how to read DNA exceedingly well. The price performance of DNA sequencing is moving today at 5 times the pace of Moore's law. This is doubling in its price performance every 4 months today, maybe the fastest moving technology we've ever seen. 13 years ago, it cost $3 billion to sequence the first human genome. The second one cost about 400 million. Third one was about 50 million. Fourth one was about 14 million. Does anybody know what it is today? We're down today to $1,000. Right? So something that cost $3 billion 13 years ago, it's now $1,000. By next year, it will be $100. By the end of the decade, it will cost a penny. By 2020, it will be cheaper to sequence your genome than it will be to flush your toilet. Right? And when you flush your toilet, we'll probably sequence everything that goes through there because it will be an interesting and useful thing to do from a healthcare perspective. And here now we're starting to learn the comprehension side. If you have a heart attack, you need a triple dosage of this drug if you have a particular gene sequence. If you are a singer and you have perfect pitch, it's actually governed by a single gene. Now we're starting to learn how to write. And when you write DNA, we're actually manipulating life forms. There's a team working on recreating the woolly mammoth. We're about 2 years away from a live woolly mammoth wandering around. It will be a bit confused. Its habitat will have changed quite considerably. And the implications are incredible of this, right? How about if the giant panda is alive today because it looks cute? Now that we can store its genome and bring it back whenever we want to, how do we deal with the ethics of that, right? Of conservancy and so on. Extraordinary questions will be asked and answered. These are college students that get together and hack DNA. They have contests to see who has the most creative application of DNA synthesis. So 2 years ago, the winning team took resveratrol, the cancer-fighting substance in red wine, injected it into yeast, started brewing beer with the yeast, and you can now buy cancer-fighting beer if you are a beer fan, right? This team took the DNA of a jellyfish, which glows in the dark, crossed it with the DNA of a cat, and you can buy this pet that glows in the dark, okay? The cat's not very happy about it. It can't hide anymore, right? And they did this originally, by the way, because they lived on a dark street and their cats kept getting killed, being run over by cars. I'm thinking if I see a glowing cat, I'm probably going to crash the car. There's a whole other set of implications around this. And by the way, you can do this in your bedroom. You can do this in your bedroom. The technologies have democratized so fast. This is an 8-year-old girl at a local biohacking open hackerspace in Silicon Valley. She's teaching a course on how to synthesize DNA. She's 8 years old and she's leading the class. Okay? It turns out she's really good at holding the pipette at the right angles, running the Dremel she's teaching the adults how to do it. Part of the reason that we exist is how do you get across to that 8-year-old girl the ethical and moral implications of what she's doing. When I was that age, I was playing with chemistry sets, and the worst I could do is blow up the garage, right? And she can actually impact the whole of life on Earth. And so this is part of the reason that we exist. The technologies that we have access to today are billions of times more powerful than when we were that age. Here's a company of ours that's trying to create a positive spin on this. This team is 3D printing and using biotech and stem cells. They're growing a hamburger in a petri dish as opposed to hacking it out of a cow. Okay? It tastes terrible today. Our joke is the taste is doubling every year, so we'll see how that works out. And imagine the implications of this. Now, the climate change is the real issue here. We use 70 billion farm animals for meat processing a year around the world. If the middle class grows as expected, we will need an extra 50 billion farm animals within the next 2 decades, and just that might destroy the climate. Climate in the environment is maybe the biggest environmental concern we have. If you think about the atmosphere around the Earth, it's the equivalent thickness of the skin of an apple on the apple. It's a very, very thin layer that we rely on. And just this might destroy the climate if we grow the meat processing as we need to, so they're trying to solve for that. This is how crazy it's getting. This is a company in Canada called the Arctic Apple. They've found a single gene in an apple that when you bite into it, has the apple oxidize and turn brown, and they've turned it off. So if you bite into their apple, you can sit it on the table for 4 days, the apple does not turn brown. Okay? And it's pretty crazy at one level, but you can test very easily for any efficiencies or problems in that lens. We have a much higher fidelity as we manipulate this. Essentially, we're at the point where we can manipulate biology with software. And that has enormous implications. One last technology is neuroscience, and the acceleration that we're seeing in this area is actually imaging. This is our old view of the brain. On the right, a lump of jelly. We didn't know quite what was going on. And now we can actually track a single a neuron firing in your brain in real time. And so this is incredible what we're able to do as we can now image what's happening in the brain. This is a team, if you look at the photograph in the middle, this is a team called Dreamcatcher. That you go to sleep in an MRI machine. While you're asleep, they're storing the images coming off your visual cortex, and the objective is to store that and play your dreams back to you the next day. Right? Now my wife wants to get her hands on that. I'm less interested in that, and you can see the delicacy of where this goes, right? And so this is moving very quickly. Enormous potential for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, and neurological diseases as this goes along. So you get some sense of this. This is a contest being run by Peter Diamandis called the Tricorder X Prize, literally for the Star Trek tricorder. It's a $10 million prize. The winning team will win $10 million when a handheld wireless diagnostic device can beat the diagnosis of 10 board-certified doctors. Right? So when the device can do a better job of diagnosing a condition than 10 doctors, a $10 million prize will be won. 300 teams have been competing for this prize. We're down to the last 10. They expect the prize to be won by the end of this year. So by the end of this year, we will have a device that can outperform most doctors at diagnosis. Think of the implications of that, especially in developing countries or rural areas where you have the doctor to citizen ratios very, very low. Right? Hypochondriacs will have a field day with this particular technology, right? We'll keep checking whether they're okay or not, etc. And maybe the most profound thing that we're seeing is solar energy. It turns out that the price performance of solar cells is riding an exponential curve. They're doubling in their price performance every 22 to 25 months. At this current pace, we will hit 100% of world energy supply deliverable by solar in 25 years. Now this has the technologies are all very sexy, right? I could go on for a long time and I could have lots of cool videos, et cetera. But the one big concern that we have is that society is not ready for this. All of the mechanisms that we use to run the world, our politics, our civics, our legal systems, healthcare, education, intellectual property, religion, you name it, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago. not for the world of today. Definitely not for this trillion sensors coming down the pipe. We actually need to re-architect every single one of those mechanisms. I'm actually very pessimistic about the US today. I don't think any major movement will be made there. Europe is in a hell of a mess. It used to be, a few hundred years ago, that it was a real advantage to be a big country. You have critical mass of resources, you had critical mass of industries, et cetera, et cetera. In this next century, it will be a huge disadvantage to be a big country. It will be a huge advantage to be a medium-sized country, because you have a lot more flexibility and a lot more adaptability around how you navigate it. And in a world that's changing so fast, adaptability becomes the higher order bit. This is Airbnb. How many of you are familiar with Airbnb? Right? You take your extra bedroom and you open it up as a hotel room. This is from 2 years ago. Peter Thiel invested in Airbnb at a valuation of 40% of Hyatt hotels worldwide. And people said, you're kind of crazy, that's a hell of a valuation. He had spotted the exponential growth in the room nights of Airbnb and invested in that exponential growth. And maybe Silicon Valley is better at spotting this curve than most other places. Airbnb today, Airbnb recently had 500,000 rooms occupied in one night around the world. By the end of this year, it will be the biggest hotel chain in the world. And they don't own any hotels. What an amazing business to be in, right? Now, if you think about the hotel business, 5 years ago, you would never have predicted that something like this could happen. It was impossible. All of the established players have huge legacy assets and advantages, brands, etc. In 5 years, out of nothing, we have the biggest hotel chain in the world. For example, a farmer with a smartphone in Mexico or Africa has more information power in his or her hands than Clinton did when he was president. That's a pretty profound thing to say. We go from one of the most powerful people in the world to one of the poorest in less than a generation.